Hello, my name is Sam Murray and I'm from Middlesex University, and today I'm going to be presenting my paper entitled Building an Ecology for Live Music in Gwlad, an analysis of the music industry in Wales inquiry. I'd like to thank the IASPM committee for inviting me and the conference committee as well for inviting me to present this paper for you today and for all the phenomenal work that they've done to get this conference online and keep it going. The work that I'm going to be presenting is work in progress, so any thoughts that you might have on the content that I discuss, I would really appreciate some feedback, so feel free to leave them in the comments below. Also, it's important to say that the majority of this paper is going to be focusing on the inquiry itself, so I won't be looking in detail at previous scholarship on the topic of cultural policy, but do acknowledge there are many wonderful scholars in this area. For example, Paul Carr, who's done a lot of research around music policy in Wales. And also I will be not looking in depth at theoretical concepts that's going to be focused in the paper. So this is mostly about responding to the inquiry and exploring the themes within. So I'm going to start off by briefly explaining Wales's background in terms of cultural policy and the journey that they went through to achieve devolved cultural policy. And despite having such a clear, unique cultural identity, Wales was unable to determine its own cultural policy until the forming of the National Assembly for Wales in 1999. This was formed as a result of the Government of Wales Act in '98 and initiated by a devolution referendum in 1997. But it wasn't actually until 2011 that Wales could introduce its own primary cultural legislation, because previously legislation had to go through Westminster. So even though policy was enacted on from 1999, legislation couldn't actually be proposed to 2011. The latest development has been that the National Assembly for Wales has now become Senedd Cymru, or the Welsh Parliament. And Senedd Cymru has really been trying to explore and recognise the developing potential for Wales as a nation to become a testbed of innovative cultural policy. One of the ways this has been explored is through a series of inquiries that are run by relevant policy committees. And today we're going to be focusing on the music industry in Wales inquiry. Now, this particular inquiry was organised by what's called the Culture, Welsh Language and Communications Committee. And as you can see here on the side, here are all the various members of the committee, and it's chaired by Bethan Said from Plaid Cymru. And this particular inquiry was launched in 2019 to look at very much the context of what was happening in live music in Wales. So looking at the venue closures that have happened, and also the key policy challenges that existed around planning, licensing and business rates. What this inquiry did was it gathered evidence from a whole wide variety of different people within the industry, but actually called 21 expert witnesses who were very much in different areas of the live music industry. It's recognised that this is a sample, and of course not everybody who works in this space, but really tried to gather a holistic review of what was happening. As you can see at the bottom, there is a little diagram of the stages in which this inquiry has gone through, and currently the committee are drafting a report. The report was due out earlier, but due to COVID, this has been delayed. Live music has been the main focus of this part of the inquiry, but there are actually plans to do a new inquiry along the same lines on specifically recorded music in Wales, so calling different experts who would have expertise in that field. This paper is going to explore 4 topics that were raised as a result of this particular inquiry, which is music funding, looking at venues as the foundation of live music in Wales, live music ecologies, and building a wide-reaching ecology for future generations as well. So the first part I'm going to start off with is challenges that exist in funding. And Wales faces a challenge in getting the correct balance to exist between different genres of music, but also the balance in offering support to private live music industry. What you're going to see now are 2 clips that really highlight a disconnect that I feel exists between the music industry itself and being aware of the funding that they could interact with, and similarly funding circles being aware of the needs of industry. So the first clip that I'm going to play is from Samantha Dabb, who is a venue owner of Le Public Space in Newport, articulating that she doesn't quite know how to access Arts Council Wales and the funding that they offer.
Council obviously they play in terms of supporting art and culture and activity in Wales. What would you say about Arts Council Wales and the way that, you know, their advice and support operates. You know, does it provide helpful advice
I'm going to say I don't know who Arts Council Wales are or how to access
No, you've
them.
had no
contact.
No,
I mean, I know people that work within theatre that know people within the Arts Council Wales, but in terms of the music industry, no, they don't engage at all.
Have you ever sought any advice from them?
We have, but that was very much via a friend who knew someone from the Arts Council Wales who came in and had a pint. There was nothing formal about it. It was, you know, I know this.
Yeah.
I put a bid for this and I made friends with this person and then they came in for a pint. But there was never,
so never
done anything formally.
Never formally approached them. Why is that then? Is, you know, is that something?
I don't even know the route to do that. It's not something that's ever clearly mapped, I think.
So what's interesting there is Sam is saying that she doesn't really know who to talk to at the Arts Council and to access any of the funding, or even what funds are available to access as well, and to have support from the live music industry. What's really interesting from the Arts Council Wales response that you're going to see now is that they do have funding available for infrastructure and to support music venues. And they have previously worked with venues like Club Evil back in Cardiff. But they're now going to talk a bit about that approach. And then in this clip, they're particularly challenged by the chair of the committee, Bethan Said, about the fact that venues don't actually know they exist. So let's see their response.
See that they hadn't had any contact really with the Arts Council in Wales, and they also felt that the forms that had to be filled in to apply for available support were very daunting and off-putting.
That's one of the reasons we're currently undergoing a lottery review, and one of the things that we're looking at is how do we simplify and make more accessible our funding. So that's something it's already on our radar. And I suppose in terms of what Anton was saying, the kind of most of our support, because we have all of us is public money, tends to go to support charitable organisations. We very rarely support commercial ventures unless they come specifically to us with a project that is quite bespoke.
If they don't know you exist, how do they come to
it? I think that we need to look at our accessibility and how we kind of develop.
Because I was saying, I think that I picked up was that, you know, you're helping Club Evil back, but since the public space might want that, but they just wouldn't know what to do from the experience they gave us. I'm not saying that's my experience. I'm saying that's what they were.
And it's really valid for us to hear that, and I think we need to look at how when we're looking at the Music Industry Development Fund, how we move that forward and how do we make it more accessible.
Okay,
so what's really interesting there as well is that issues are raised on, for example, application forms, the fact that it takes a long time for anybody in the music sector to be able to do these, and they have already raised before the committee that this is quite a tricky process. So coming forward, I've kind of tried to distill all of this into an examination of the music funding landscape that exists in Wales, and I really think that during this inquiry, these following issues were mostly identified. I really feel that there's a disconnect that exists at the moment between industry and Arts Council Wales in understanding what each other wants, needs, space for collaboration, and how funding can be used effectively. Because whilst it would be good to make these particular forms and application processes easier for industry, the Arts Council have an obligation to protect public funding from misuse, and they also need to make sure that these are going to be used properly. So a balance needs to be found between these two different factors. Also, what's really interesting is the Arts Council themselves admit that the majority of their funding goes to classical music, as you can see here from portfolio manager Anton Owen Hicks, who talks about this here, saying that they're aware of a need to reach these non-classical forms, pop, rock, jazz, etc., and that actually the music industry development scheme that they have was very much targeted at those sectors, but they're not kind of engaging with it, or we can go as far as saying even know it exists and even be able to find out how they can apply for that as well. But what is incredibly clear from evidence given in these sessions, and I'm sorry I can't go into more detail and show them due to time constraints, but there has been success with particularly small interventions. So whilst the vast majority of funding is not going into these music forms, the small interventions have been really, really crucial in supporting live music activity. For example, Noson Alan, or Night Out in English, which is a programme that takes a risk out of putting on performances in community spaces in rural areas. And this has allowed a lot of rural areas to do that, whether it be Machynlleth, whether it be Prestine, and other places around Wales who've been really able to use this fund to bring performances to their communities. There's also quite a lot of funding available for talent and skills development for young people as well, and looking at how this could be improved could really be a collaborative process with the industry and find out how to provide young people with those skills that industry needs as well. The next issue I'm going to look at that was raised within discussions was this idea of venues as the foundation for live music. So as I've said here, live music in Wales is heavily supported by venues who put on live shows, and they also play a crucial role in talent development. Whilst festivals may be happening in Wales, it's the venues that are permanently there and are constantly putting on activity and encouraging activity in communities. And they are the spaces in which people can make their first performances or learn how to become a sound engineer or many of the other technical roles that exist in facilitating live music. And there's a really nice quote here from Gitta Bricken, who is the person who runs Clwb i Forbach. Clwb i Forbach is a quite well-known grassroots venue in Cardiff. And he was saying that, 60% of the arena level artists started in venues such as his. And that's the point, that without places like us, bands don't start off. This is where they develop their skills, see what works, but where they also develop their audience. And this really speaks to this idea of a kind of venue hierarchy, that bands grow their audiences, then progress up this ladder to venues with a larger capacity as well. But also another element that was discussed that hasn't really been appreciated by the Welsh Government at present is the idea that music venues are really support systems for live music communities and act as cultural hubs and have immense cultural value to bring together, whether it be subcultures or whether it just be communities of people interested in live music, and find ways to make it more accessible for those people. Whereas Welsh Government might have been specifically funding cultural centres like somewhere like St David's Hall in Cardiff, which has quite a wide-ranging repertoire. Grassroots music venues can sometimes cater to very specific kinds of forms of popular music that just would never get a look in these larger spaces as well. I'm now going to look at kind of two issues that I think are key to this discussion and two policy challenges to ensuring that venues can be sustainable and remain a foundation for live music. And these are the issues of business rates and licensing. So business rates in 2017, there was a business rates revaluation, and it actually impacted venues in Wales to a very different extent depending on where venues were. So venues in larger cities, because property values might have gone up, were affected by valuations and might have had to pay higher prices. Also, what's important to note that guidance around rate relief is incredibly complex for venues to access and understand. And many venue owners, as you can see Sam and Gary here, who are both venue owners in front of the committee, really express it, that they don't understand how their venue is not meeting particular criteria, and they try and match it, but then realise that potentially goalposts have been shifted and they can't qualify. Also, a huge problem is that many business rate relief programs are actually discretionary for local authorities to apply. And it all kind of depends on guidance for local councils to decide whether they want to implement that or not. And this has become quite tricky because due to local service cuts that have happened, councils are more reliant on business rates, revenue income, and are perhaps choosing not to apply them so that they can preserve that income stream. So there needs to be a balance for local authorities to be able to generate the revenue they need for local services, but also to ensure that live music activity can happen and that venues can be allowed to exist and continue to operate. Another huge challenge is licensing for venues, and licensing could be considered a prohibitive principle in the fact that licensing is all about kind of controlling live music activity and kind of saying what can't be done, and perhaps to some extent saying what can be done, but really trying to limit the activity. It also is reflective of the fact there is a lack of policy to encourage live music around Wales. It's all kind of prohibitive and controlling. But also there's an inconsistency in licensing across different authorities. So we had venue owners in Swansea and Newport come to the committee and say, yes, we have great relationships with our licensing committees, but you then have venues in Cardiff who really don't think that's the case and feel that they are forced to comply and having to spend a lot of money on those kind of compliance orders and issues as well. So to explain this kind of idea of why licenses is quite prohibitive, I'm now going to play a clip from Tom Keel, who is the acting CEO of UK Music. And when he appeared before the committee, he discussed this idea of prohibitive licensing being prohibitive legislation.
In relation to entertainment and alcohol, and if so, what are the main ones you have?
I think from our perspective, we always see the licensing system exist, but it's a very permissive system in the sense that it tries to almost essentially discourage activities from happening from the outset. There's no real objective within the Licensing Act which has really pushes for culture, or although this is kind of like one of the main regulatory frameworks behind culture, there's nothing in it to really empower cultural events to happen. It's all about protecting, very, very validly, protecting about nuisance, public disorder, those type of things. We've seen changes in the legislative framework with entertainment licensing from local authorities being deregulated in the last 10 years. But some of those challenges are still there. The timings are still quite restrictive in itself. So as a kind of piece of legislation, we see that there's potentially an opportunity there to maybe strengthen it. I think if this committee could maybe look at how you empower that legislation to be proactive and actually try to encourage events rather than discourage events, then that would be a definitely step in the right direction.
Okay, in terms of the way the local authorities happen.
Yeah.
So a really important point that Tom is raising here at the end of his contribution was this idea that whether it be the Welsh Government or local authorities, when it comes to licensing, they need to be proactive in engaging with venues to try and evolve a lot of the issues, because quite a lot of the time venues find themselves in a position of having to be reactionary to licensing legislation, whereas there could be the opportunity for collaboration to avoid this. But it's really important because this really speaks to a need to build trust with venues and engage with them as well. And it was apparent from inquiry submissions that there is a need to build trust between live music industry and government to create positive policy and legislation. Because we're in a situation where policymakers are perhaps focused on controlling live music activity and prohibiting it. And many of us might recall the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994 talking about repetitive beats and trying to shut down raves. Many scholars argue that this is perhaps the first time music is even mentioned in UK legislation, so it kind of potentially got off on a very bad footing with the music industry. And that this prohibitive legislation has really engendered mistrust from industry, and they need to make a change to ensure that this can be rebuilt, this trust can be rebuilt as well. And that needs to happen through structures of collaboration, be them music boards or be them more loose structures where venues are consulted about licensing changes that might happen. The third topic that I'm going to be exploring is this idea of live music ecologies in Wales, and trying to examine the state of live music ecologies in Wales and looking at their sustainability, but if the conditions exist. And ecology was quite interestingly used as a term in this inquiry quite often by those connected to policy roles, so contributors from Arts Council Wales and contributors from Cardiff Council. And I'm just going to play a short clip here for you from Caris Wyn Morgan, who is a portfolio manager at Arts Council Wales, talking in particular about how festivals are part of supporting a music ecology in Wales.
And then we support things such as Go Fish Guard, so that there's live music taking place in a part of Wales where there is no obvious theatre or no portfolio client in existence. So we do look at how these contribute to the health of the sector, and although you only see they're on for a week or a weekend, they can make a broader contribution to the economy and the Welsh music ecology of the year.
So it's a really, really interesting idea there that I very much think that Caris kind of summarised this as ecology as a manifestation of live music, and that these festivals and events can really connect with the environments around them and have a variety of different impacts that can really help sustain a wider ecology. But ecology in itself as a term is debated quite a lot in academia, particularly in relation to music. And my research really draws on Bear et al.'s article about live concert performance and ecological approach. And then the authors really try to question and analyse whether the term is actually useful to analysing live music and try and see if it's become a buzzword. And it's quite interesting that mostly policymakers are using it in this particular inquiry. But what they do say is that it can be a useful tool to assess 3 different ideas. So first of all, the materiality of the buildings in which live music happen, so venues, for example. Number 2, looking to demonstrate how a musical event is a product of different actors and the environment around it. And 3, really drawing attention to sustainability. And in the article itself, I go into this in more detail and try and evaluate this term, but I do feel that it is useful in this context, mostly because we do have people using it in the framework of this inquiry. So Caris does have this idea of ecology as manifestations, but there's also this concept of trying to understand the environmental, social and cultural conditions for live music making that exist in Wales, and how they can be supported and how they can be ensured that they can function, but also recognizing with things such as festivals that they really are situated within particular environments, and those environments can really contribute to really unique experience. So for example, Green Man Festival set in the Brecon Beacons, you could not have that experience anywhere else because there are no other festivals in Crickhowell in the Brecon Beacons at present that can provide that kind of aura and atmosphere, and quite a lot of people attend those festivals for not only the music but the experience themselves. Another final kind of major point to look at under live music ecologies is that of major events, and major events really help to define live music ecology in Wales and present a unique opportunity to connect music and environment. And this has mostly been done in the capital city of Cardiff because it has the infrastructure to support that. So quite a lot of the time, major tours, whether it be Beyonce or Ed Sheeran, will come and perform at the Principality Stadium in Cardiff, or they manage to buy in major events and bid for them. For example, they had the Champions League final. What Cardiff really want to do as a city is to create unique events to Cardiff, unique experiences, and build on other ecologies created by, for example, the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and seeing how that was done to create a unique Welsh event. So after looking at these ecologies, we also need to consider how we can build ecologies for future generations. And there's a particular reason I'm using this term, future generations, because Wales has a very unique policy framework that not many people are actually aware of, and this is the Wellbeing of Future Generations Wales Act. And the idea of this act is to say that any policy or legislative discussions that are happening must consider long-term impact on the future and positive long-term impact. So not merely seeking short-term solutions. And it was incredibly handy because the author of this bill, Jane Davidson, has actually just released a book about how this bill was put together. So great timing, Jane. Thank you very much for that. But within this book, she kind of talks about the 5 ways to reach decisions through the framework of this act, and talks about prevention. So this could be, for example, looking at how you stop venues closing, long-termism, collaboration that might happen with industry, for example, participation and integrating activities to reach positive outcomes for as many of the goals as possible. So this act is centred around sustainable development goals, but very Wales-specific goals. And when you tackle particular issues within the live music industry, you might find it could then have a wider impact in terms of other policy agendas as well. And as I say here, there's very much a connection of policy agendas. Ensuring support for the live music industry can fulfill the aims of a wider national ecology. So if it is to become a more sustainable country, how can the music industry play a part in that and respond to that? A major part of building an ecology for future generations, though, is really ensuring that young people have the skills to lead the music industry, the live music industry of the future. The scholar Luke Thomas, who is currently completing a PhD and is doing forthcoming research on talent development schemes in Wales, is really looking into how these particular talent development schemes can improve the lives of young performers. And he has been doing a lot of really interesting research that I can't wait to read, and definitely one to look out for. But the Future Generations Act itself provides a framework for collaboration actions to meet policy objectives, such as ensuring a strong cultural provision in Wales. And it's really important that industry can collaborate with government to solve challenges in the live music industry. So industry needs to be able to have that connection, but then recognising that industry, tackling industry challenges can actually impact wider policy agendas as well. And the government can play a role in that. So when the industry actually tries to solve its own problems, it can have an impact on wider policy agendas, whether it's creating spaces to discuss mental health or tackling inequalities through musical provision. And the government can become part of that process and really engage and interact with it. But also, the government can play a role in removing the constraints of policy and legislation to allow this support of talent development. One example I'm going to play now is from Samantha Damp, who runs Le Public Space, who has a really interesting idea about how the constraints of business rates could be flexed to allow and encourage venues to really be part of talent development. So I'm just going to share this with you now.
I do this anyway, so everyone else who works in live music venue might be angry. But for me, I feel like you need to be working with encouraging people to get into live music, not just putting bands on, but running workshops and, you know, trying to get 14-year-olds to pick up a guitar, because they're not picking up guitars at the moment. And I think the rate relief should be linked to, you know, how much you're putting into the Welsh music industry and the future of Welsh music, not just checking a band on a Sunday.
I think
so it's really, really interesting idea there that actually you could support venues through rate relief if they do put back into the music industry itself. So it's really encouraging a particular pattern of behaviour from venues and incentivising it. Of course, there are wider debates and issues as to whether government should be incentivising industry activity or not, and how that should be connected. But what's really clear is that industry has solutions, and there are many, many more solutions that I talk about in my research that are put forward, whether it's music boards, whether it's conducting talent development in specific ways. But there is a will to make these things happen. Government just needs to be able to hear these and collaborate throughout this process. So this was more of a kind of snapshot of the research themes that I've been looking at through my investigation around the live music industry, the music industry in Wales inquiry focusing on live music. And I've kind of come at this point to three major conclusions that I think exist. So first of all, I think that there is a need for a culture shift in Welsh Government to collaborate and co-create positive policy and legislation to protect the music industry and let it prosper. So it's the idea of gaining trust of industry, but really working and collaborating so there isn't a constant sense of industry having to be reactionary to what the government is doing. And actually by collaborating, they could achieve wider goals that could be fulfilled under, for example, the Future Generations Act. It's important to also recognise that Wales is a small nation, but it can act as a testbed for new and innovative ideas due to its scale. So it could try things out and pilot ideas out that could have a wider impact in the other nations of the UK, or even have a wider impact across the world and actually make Wales quite world leading in terms of policy. It has its own Parliament, it has its own Senedd to be able to create this kind of legislation. So I really feel passionate that the Welsh Government should really seize that opportunity and explore those ideas in different ways. There could also be the possibility for Westminster to try and invest into that process as well. But Wales has enough ability to do that on its own. Finally, I think there's a really unique opportunity for collaboration between policymakers and industry. And to do that, they can use the tools of the Future Generations Act, and innovations can be made in music policy that creates sustainable solutions. No other country in the world has a framework like the Future Generations Act to make policy that really thinks about the long-term impact that decisions will have. And I really passionately believe that an outcome of this inquiry could be that the government engages industry in a way to make some really exciting and innovative policy that will allow the music ecology in Wales to prosper and to be sustainable for future generations to come. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I've just got here a bibliography of the various sources that inform my thinking. I do go into these sources in more detail in my actual paper itself. And then also just quickly an appendix list of all the various contributors who were called for evidence before this committee as well. So I would really appreciate any feedback or thoughts that you might have below. I will hopefully try and attend the early career researchers kind of discussions around these particular papers as well. But I really want to thank you for taking time to watch my paper and listen, and do get in touch if you have any more thoughts and ideas. And thank you very much for your time.